This is Audible.
Galaxy in Flames by Ben Counter. Read by Toby Longworth. Part 1. Long Knives. Chapter 1. The Emperor Protects. Long Night. The Music of the Spheres. "I was there," said Titus Cassar, his wavering voice barely reaching the back of the chamber. "I was there the day that Horus turned his face from the Emperor." His words brought a collective sigh from the Lectitio Divinitatis congregation, and as one, they lowered their heads at such a terrible thought. From the back of the chamber, an abandoned munitions hold deep in the underdecks of the War Master's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, Kirill Sinderman watched and winced at Cassar's awkward delivery. The man was no iterator, that was for sure, but his words carried the sure and certain faith of someone who truly believed in the things he was saying. Sinderman envied him that certainty. It had been many months since he had felt anything approaching certainty. As the primary iterator of the 63rd Expedition, it was Kirill Sinderman's job to promulgate the imperial truth of the Great Crusade, illuminating those worlds brought into compliance of the rule of the Emperor and the glory of the Imperium. Bringing the light of reason and secular truth to the furthest flung reaches of the ever-expanding human empire had been a noble undertaking. But somewhere along the way, things had gone wrong. Sinderman wasn't sure when it had happened. On Zenobia? On Davin? On Aureus? Or on any of a dozen other worlds brought into compliance? Once he had been known as the arch-prophet of secular truth, but times had changed, and he found himself remembering his Solonum, the Summatorum philosopher who had wondered why the light of new science seemed not to illuminate as far as the old sorceries had. Titus Cassar continued his droning sermon, and Sinderman returned his attention to the man. Tall and angular, Cassar wore the uniform of a Moderati Primus, one of the senior commanders of the Dies Irae, an Imperator-class battle titan. Sinderman suspected it was this rank, combined with his earlier friendship with Euphrates Keeler, that had granted his status within the Lectitio Divinitatis, status that he was clearly out of his depth in handling. Euphrates Keeler. Imagist, evangelist, saint. He remembered meeting Euphrates, a feisty, supremely self-confident woman, on the embarkation deck before they had left for the surface of 6319, unaware of the horror they would witness in the depths of the Whisperhead Mountains. Together with Captain Loken, they had seen the warp-spawned monstrosity Xaver Jubal had been wrought into. Sinderman had struggled to rationalize what he had seen by burying himself in his books and learning to better understand what had occurred. Euphrates had no such sanctuary and had turned to the growing Lectitio Divinitatis cult for solace. Venerating the Emperor as a divine being, the cult had grown from humble beginnings to a movement that was spreading throughout the expedition fleets of the galaxy, much to the fury of the War Master. Where before the cult had lacked a focus, in Euphrates Keeler it had found its first martyr and saint. Sinderman remembered the day when he had witnessed Euphrates Keeler stand before a nightmare horror from beyond the gates of the Imperium and hurl it back from whence it had come. He had seen her bathed in killing fire and walk away unscathed, a blinding light streaming from the outstretched hand in which she had held a silver imperial eagle. Others had seen it too. Ingmei Singh, mistress of the fleet's astropaths, and a dozen of the ship's armsmen. Word had spread fast, and Euphrates had become overnight a saint in the eyes of the faithful, and an icon to cling to on the frontier of space. He was unsure why he had even come to this meeting. Not a meeting, he corrected himself, but a service, a religious sermon. for there was a very real danger of recognition. Membership of the Lectitio Divinitatis was forbidden, and if he were discovered, it would be the end of his career as an iterator. "Now we shall contemplate the word of the Emperor," continued Cassar, reading from a small leather chapbook. Sinderman was reminded of the Bondsman No. 7 books, in which the late Ignace Carcassy had written his scandalous poetry. Poetry that had, if Mercedy Ollerton's suspicions were correct, caused his murder. Sinderman thought that the writings of the Lectitio Divinitatis were scarcely less dangerous. "We have some new faithful among us," said Cassar, and Sinderman felt every eye in the chamber turn upon him. Used to facing an entire continent's worth of audience, Sinderman was suddenly acutely embarrassed by their scrutiny. "When people are first drawn to adoration of the Emperor, it is only natural that they should have questions," said Cassar. "They know the Emperor must be a god, for he has godlike powers over all human species, but aside from this, they are in the dark." This, at least, Sinderman agreed with. "Most importantly, they ask, if the Emperor truly is a god, then what does he do with his divine power? We do not see his hand reaching down from the sky, and precious few of us are blessed with visions granted by him. So, does he not care for the majority of his subjects? They do not see the falsehood of such a belief. His hand lies upon all of us, and every one of us owes him our devotion. In the depths of the warp, the Emperor's mighty soul does battle with the dark things that would break through and consume us all. On Terra, he creates wonders that will bring peace, enlightenment, and the fruition of all our dreams to the galaxy. The Emperor guides us, teaches us, and exhorts us to become more than we are, but most of all, the Emperor protects." "The Emperor protects," said the congregation in unison. "The faith of the Lectitio Divinitatis, the divine word of the Emperor, is not an easy path to follow. Where the imperial truth is comforting in its rigorous rejection of the unseen and the unknown, the divine word requires the strength to believe in that which we cannot see. The longer we look upon this dark galaxy and live through the fires of its conquest, the more we realize that the Emperor's divinity is the only truth that can exist. We do not seek out the divine word. Instead, we hear it and are compelled to follow it. Faith is not a flag of allegiance or a theory for debate. It is something deep within us, complete and inevitable. The Lectitio Divinitatis is the expression of that faith, and only by acknowledging the divine word can we understand the path the Emperor has laid before mankind." Fine words, thought Sinderman. Fine words, poorly delivered, but heartfelt. He could see that they had touched something deep inside those who heard it. An orator of skill could sway entire worlds with such words and force of belief. Before Cassar could continue, Sinderman heard sudden shouts coming from the maze of corridors that led into the chamber. He turned as a panicked woman hurled the door behind him open with a dull clang of metal. In her wake, Sinderman could hear the hard bangs of bolter rounds. The congregation started in confusion, looking to Cassar for an explanation, but the man was as nonplussed as they were. "They found you!" yelled Sinderman, realizing what was happening. "Everyone, get out!" shouted Cassar. "Scatter!" Sinderman pushed his way through the panicking crowd to the front of the chamber and towards Cassar. Some members of the congregation were producing guns, and from their martial bearing, Sinderman guessed they were Imperial Army troopers. Some were clearly ship's crewmen, and Sinderman knew enough of religion to know that they would defend their faith with violence if they had to. "Come on, Iterator, it's time we got out of here," said Cassar, dragging the venerable Iterator towards one of the many access corridors that radiated from the chamber. Seeing the worry on his face, Cassar said, "Don't worry, Kirill. The Emperor protects." "I certainly hope so," replied Sinderman breathlessly. Shots echoed from the ceiling, and bright muzzle flashes strobed from the walls. Sinderman threw a glance over his shoulder and saw the bulky armored form of Astartes entering the chamber. His heart skipped a beat at the thought of being the enemy of such warriors. Sinderman into the access corridor and through a set of blast doors, their path twisting through the depths of the ship. The Vengeful Spirit was an immense vessel, and he had no idea of the layout of this area, its walls grim and industrial compared to the magnificence of the upper decks. Do you know where you're going? Wheezed Cinderman, his breath coming in hot, agonized spikes, and his ancient limbs already tiring from exertion he was scarcely used to. Engineering, said Cassar. It's like a maze down there, and we have friends in the engine crew. Damn! Why can't they just let us be? Because they are scared of you, said Cinderman, just like I was. And you are certain of this? Asked Horus, Primarch of the Sons of Horus Legion and War Master of the Imperium, his voice echoing around the cavernous strategium of the vengeful spirit. As certain as I can be, said Ing-Mei Sing, the 63rd Expedition's mistress of astropaths. Her face was lined and drawn, and her blind eyes were sunken within ravaged eye sockets. The demands of sending hundreds of telepathic communications across the galaxy weighed heavily on her skeletal frame. Astropathic acolytes gathered about her, robed in the same ghostly white as she, and wordlessly whispering muttered doggerel of the ghastly images in their heads. How long do we have? Asked Horus. As with all things connected with the warp, it is difficult to be precise, replied Ing-Mei Sing. Mistress Sing, said Horus coldly, precision is exactly what I need from you, now more than ever. The direction of the crusade will change dramatically at this news, and if you are wrong, it will change for the worse. My lord, I cannot give you an exact answer, but I believe that within days the gathering warp storms will obscure the Astronomicon from us, replied Ing-Mei Sing, ignoring the War Master's implicit threat. Though she could not see them, she could feel the hostile presence of the Justaeran warriors, the sons of Horus' First Company Terminators, lurking in the shadows of the strategium. Within days, we shall hardly see it. Our minds can barely reach across the void, and the navigators claim that they will soon be unable to guide us through. The galaxy will be a place of night and darkness. Horus pounded a hand into his fist. Do you understand what you say? Nothing more dangerous could happen to the crusade. I merely state what I see, War Master. If you are wrong. The threat was not idle. No threat the War Master uttered ever was. There had been a time when the War Master's anger would never have led to such an overt threat, but the violence in Horus's tone suggested that such a time had long passed. If we are wrong, we suffer. It has never been any different. And my brother Primarchs, what news from them? Asked Horus. We have been unable to confirm contact with the blessed Sanguinius, replied Ing-Mei Sing. And Leman Russ has sent no word of his campaign against the Thousand Suns. Horus laughed, a harsh, chthonic bark, and said, That doesn't surprise me. The wolf has had his head, and he'll not easily be distracted from teaching Magnus a lesson. And the others? Vulcan and Dawn are returning to Terra. The other Primarchs are pursuing their current campaigns. That is good at least, said Horus, brow furrowing in thought. And what of the Fabricator General? Forgive me, War Master, but we have received nothing from Mars. We shall endeavor to make contact by mechanical means, but this will take many months. You have failed in this thing. Coordination with Mars is essential. Ing-Mei Sing had telepathically broadcast a multitude of encoded messages between the Vengeful Spirit and Fabricator General Kelbor Howell of the Mechanicum in the last few weeks. Although their substance was unknown to her, the emotions contained in them were all too clear. Whatever the War Master was planning, the Mechanicum was a key part of it. Horus spoke again, distracting her from her thoughts. The other Primarchs, have they received their orders? They have, my lord, said Ing-Mei Sing, unable to keep the unease from her voice. The reply from Lord Guilliman of the Ultramarines was clean and strong. He confirms Kalth as the muster point and has begun marshalling his forces. And Lorgar? Asked Horus. Ing-Mei Sing paused, as if unsure how to phrase her next words. His message had residual symbols of pride and obedience. Very strong, almost fanatical. He acknowledges your order and is making good speed. Ing-Mei Sing prided herself on her immense self-control, as befitted one whose emotions had to be kept in check, lest they be changed by the influence of the warp. but even she could not keep some emotion from surfacing. "Something bothers you, Mistress Singh?" asked Horus, as though reading her mind.
My lord?
"You seem troubled by my orders,"
It is not my place to be troubled or otherwise, my lord,
said Ingmei Singh neutrally.
Correct,
agreed Horus.
It is not.
Yet you doubt the wisdom of my course.
No,
cried Ingmei Singh.
It is just that it is hard not to feel the nature of your communication, the weight of blood and death that each message is wreathed in. It is like breathing fiery smoke with every message we send.
You must trust me, Mistress Singh, said Horus. Trust that everything I do is for the good of the Imperium. Do you understand?
It is not my place to understand,
whispered the Astropath.
My role in the crusade is to do the will of my War Master.
That is true. But before I dismiss you, Mistress Singh, tell me something.
Yes, my lord.
Tell me of Euphrates Keeler, said Horus. Tell me of the one they are calling the Saint.
Will do.
Loken still took Mercedes Ollerton's breath away. The Astartes were astonishing enough when arrayed for war in their burnished plate, but that sight had been nothing compared to what a space marine, specifically Loken, looked like without his armor. Stripped to the waist and wearing only pale fatigues and combat boots, Loken glistened with sweat as he ducked and wove between the combat appendages of a training servitor. Although few of the remembrancers had been privileged enough to witness an Astartes fight in battle, it was said that they could kill with their bare hands as effectively as they could with a bolter and chainsword. Watching Loken demolishing the servitor limb by limb, Mercedes could well believe it. She saw such power in his broad, over-muscled torso and such intense focus in his sharp grey eyes that she wondered that she was not repelled by Loken. He was a killing machine, created and trained to deal death, but she couldn't help watching and blink-clicking images of his heroic physique. Kirill Sinderman sat next to her and leaned over, saying, "Don't you have plenty of pics of Garville already?" Loken tore the head from the training servitor and turned to face them both, and Mercedes felt a thrill of anticipation. It had been too long since the conclusion of the war against the technocracy, and she had spent too few hours with the captain of the 10th Company. As his documentarist, she knew that she had a paucity of material following that campaign, but Loken had kept himself to himself in the past few months.
Kirill Mercedes,
said Loken, marching past them towards his arming chamber.
It is good to see you both.
I'm glad to be here, Garville, said Sinderman. The primary iterator was an old man, and Mercedes was sure he had aged a great deal in the years since the fire that had nearly killed him in the archive halls of the Vengeful Spirit.
Very glad. Mercedes was kind enough to bring me. I have had a spell of exertion recently, and I am not as fit as once I was. Time's winged chariot draws near.
A quote? asked Loken.
A fragment,
replied Sinderman.
I haven't seen much of either of you recently,
observed Loken, smiling down at her.
Have I been replaced by a more interesting subject?
Not at all, she replied. But it is becoming more and more difficult for us to move around the ship. The edict from Malachhurst, you must have heard of it.
I have,
agreed Loken, lifting a piece of armor and opening a tin of his ubiquitous lapping powder.
Though I haven't studied the particulars.
The smell of the powder reminded Mercedes of happier times in this room, recording the tales of great triumphs and wondrous sights, but she cast off such thoughts of nostalgia. We are restricted to our own quarters and the retreat. We need permission to be anywhere else.
Permission from whom?
asked Loken. She shrugged. I'm not sure. The edict speaks of submitting requests to the office of the Lupercal's court, but no one's been able to get any kind of response from whatever that is.
That must be frustrating,
observed Loken, and Mercedes felt her anger rise at such an obvious statement. Well, of course it is. We can't record the Great Crusade if we can't interact with its warriors. We can barely even see them, let alone talk to them.
You made it here,
Loken pointed out. Well, yes. Following you around has taught me how to keep a low profile, Captain Loken. It helps that you train on your own now. Mercedes caught the hurt look in Loken's eye and instantly regretted her words. In previous times, Loken could often be found sparring with fellow officers, the smirking Cedere, whose flinty dead eyes reminded Mercedy of an ocean predator, Nero Vipers, or his Mornival brother Tarek Torgadon, but Loken fought alone now. By choice or by design, she did not know.
Anyway, continued Mercedy, it's getting bad for us. No one's speaking to us. We don't know what's going on anymore.
We're on a war footing,
said Loken, putting down his armor and looking her straight in the eye.
The fleet is heading for a rendezvous. We're joining up with Astartes from the other legions. It'll be a complex campaign. Perhaps the War Master is just taking precautions.
No, Garfield, said Cinderman. It's more than just that. And I know you well enough to know that you don't believe that either.
Really?
Snarled Loken.
You think you know me that well?
Well enough, Garfield, nodded Cinderman. Well enough. They're cracking down on us. Cracking down hard. Not so everyone can see it, but it's happening. You know it too.
Do I?
Ignace Carcassy, said Mercedy. Loken's face crumpled, and he looked away, unable to hide the grief he felt for the dead Carcassy, the irascible poet who had been under his protection. Ignace Carcassy had been nothing but trouble and inconvenience, but he had also been a man who had dared to speak out and tell the unpalatable truths that needed to be told. They say he killed himself, continued Cinderman, unwilling to let Loken's grief dissuade him from his course. But I've never known a man more convinced that the galaxy needed to hear what he had to say. He was angry at the massacre on the embarkation deck, and he wrote about it. He was angry with a lot of things, and he wasn't afraid to speak of them. Now he is dead, and he's not the only one.
Not the only one?
Asked Loken.
Who else?
Petronella Viva, that insufferable documentarist woman. They say she got closer to the War Master than anyone, and now she's gone too. And I don't think it was back to Terra.
I remember her. But you are on thin ice, Kirill. You need to be very clear what you are suggesting.
Cinderman did not flinch from Loken's gaze and said, I believe that those who oppose the will of the War Master are being killed. The Iterator was a frail man, but Mercedy had never been more proud to know him, as he stood unbending before a warrior of the Astartes and told him something he didn't want to hear. Cinderman paused, giving Loken ample time to refute his claims and remind them all that the Emperor had chosen Horus as the War Master because he alone could be trusted to uphold the imperial truth. Horus was the man to whom every son of Horus had pledged his life 100 times over. But Loken said nothing, and Mercedy's heart sank. I have read of it more times than I can remember, continued Cinderman. The Uranian Chronicles, for example. The first thing those tyrants did was to murder those who spoke out against their tyranny. The overlords of the Indonesic Dark Age did the same thing. Mark my words, the age of strife was made possible when the doubting voices fell silent, and now it is happening here.
You have always taught temperance, Kirill, said Loken, weighing up arguments and never leaping past them into guesswork. We're at war, and we have plenty of enemies already without you seeking to find new ones. It will be very dangerous for you, and you may not like what you find. I do not wish to see you come to any harm, either of you.
Ha! Now you lecture me, Garfield, sighed Cinderman. So much has changed. You're not just a warrior anymore, are you?
And you are not just an Iterator?
No, I suppose not, nodded Cinderman. An Iterator promulgates the imperial truth, does he not? He does not pick holes in it and spread rumors. But Carcassy is dead, and there are other things.
What things?
Asked Loken.
You mean Keeler?
Perhaps, said Cinderman, shaking his head. I don't know, but I feel she is part of it.
Part of what?
You heard what happened in the archive chamber.
With Euphrates? Yes. There was a fire, and she was badly hurt. She ended up in a coma.
I was there, said Cinderman. Kirill, said Mercedy, a note of warning in her voice. Please, Mercedy, said Cinderman. I know what I saw.
What did you see? Asked Loki.
Lies,
Replied Cinnamon, his voice hushed.
lies made real. A creature, something from the warp. Somehow Keeler and I brought it through the gates of the Imperium with the Book of Lorgar. My own damn fault, too. It was sorcery. The one thing that all these years I've been preaching is a lie. But it was real, and standing before me as surely as I stand before you now. It should have killed us, but Euphrates stood against it, and lived.
How? Asked Logan.
That's the part where I run out of rational explanations, Garfield.
Shrugged Cinnamon. Well,
Hello, Commander.
what do you think happened?
In light of the
Cinnamon
recent
exchanged a glance with Mercedy,
extraterrestrial
and she willed him not to say anything more.
Council of Nations
But the venerable
has
iterator
reviewed
continued.
to approve the activation
When you
of the
destroyed
Xcom
poor Jubal,
project.
it was with your guns,
You have been
but
chosen
Euphrates
to
was
lead this
unarmed.
initiative.
All she had was her
Oversee
faith.
our first
Her faith in the Emperor.
line of defense.
I think it was the light of the Emperor that cast the horror back to the warp.
Future.
Hearing Kirill Sindarin talk of faith and the light of the Emperor was too much for Mercedy.
But Kirill, she said, there must be another explanation. Even what happened to Jubal wasn't beyond physical possibilities. The War Master himself told Loken that the thing that took Jubal was some kind of xeno creature from the warp. I've listened to you teach about how minds have been twisted by magic and superstition and all the things that blind us to reality. That's what the Imperial truth is. I can't believe that the iterator Kirill Sinderman doesn't believe the Imperial truth anymore. Believe, my dear, said Sinderman, smiling bleakly and shaking his head. Maybe belief is the biggest lie. In ages past, the earliest philosophers tried to explain the stars in the sky and the world around them. One of them conceived of the notion that the universe was mounted on giant crystal spheres, controlled by a giant machine, which explained the movements of the heavens. He was laughed at and told that such a machine would be so huge and noisy that everyone would hear it. He simply replied that we are born with that noise all around us, and that we are so used to hearing it that we cannot hear it at all. Mercedy sat beside the old man and wrapped her arms around him, surprised to find that he was shivering and his eyes were wet with tears. I'm starting to hear it, Garvio, said Sinderman, his voice quavering. I can hear the music of the spheres. Mercedy watched Loken's face as he stared at Sinderman, seeing the quality of intelligence and integrity Sinderman had recognized in him. The Astartes had been taught that superstition was the death of the Empire, and only the imperial truth was a reality worth fighting for. Now, before her very eyes, that was unwrapping our bolts. Hector Varvarus? The army commander? Asked Mercedy. I thought that was the Oretians.
No, said Loken. It was one of ours.
Why? She asked.
He wanted us, I don't know, hauled before a court-martial, brought to task for the killings on the embarkation deck. Malaghurst wouldn't agree, Varvarus wouldn't back down, and now he is dead.
Then it's true, sighed Sinderman. The naysayers are being silenced.
There are still a few of us left,
said Loken, quiet steel in his voice. Then we do something about it, Garfield, said Sinderman. We must find out what has been brought into the Legion and stop it. We can fight it, Loken. We have you. We have the truth, and there is no reason why we cannot. The sound that cut off Sinderman's voice was the door to the practice deck slamming open, followed by heavy metal-on-metal footsteps. Mercedy knew it was an Astartes even before the impossibly huge shadow fell over her. She turned to see the cursive form of Malaghurst behind her, robed in a cream tunic, edged in sea-green trim. The War Master's equerry, Malaghurst was known as the Twisted, as much for his labyrinthine mind as the horrible injuries that had broken his body and left him grotesquely malformed. His face was thunder, and anger seemed to bleed from him. Loken, he said, these are civilians.
Kirill Sinderman and Mercedy Ollerton are official remembrances of the Great Crusade, and I can vouch for them, said Logan, standing to face Malakhurst as an equal. Malakhurst spoke with Horace's authority, and Mercedy marveled at what it must take to stand up to such a man.
Perhaps you are unaware of the War Master's edict, Captain, said Malakhurst, the pleasant neutrality of his tone completely at odds with the tension that crackled between the two Astartes. These clerks and notaries have caused enough trouble. You of all people should understand that. There are to be no distractions, Loken, and no exceptions.
Loken stood face to face with Malakhurst, and for one sickening moment, Mercedy thought he was about to strike the equerry. We are all doing the work of the Great Crusade, Mal, said Loken tightly. Without these men and women, it cannot be completed.
Civilians do not fight, Captain. They only question and complain. They can record everything they desire once the war has been won, and they can spread the imperial truth once we have conquered a population that needs to hear it. Until then, they are not a part of this crusade.
No, Malakhurst, said Logan. You're wrong. And you know it. The Emperor did not create the Primarchs and the Legions so they could fight on in ignorance. He did not set out to conquer the galaxy just for it to become another dictatorship.
The Emperor, said Malakhurst, gesturing towards the door, is a long way from here.
A dozen soldiers marched into the training halls, and Mercedy recognized uniforms of the Imperial Army, but saw that their badges of unit and rank had been removed. With a start, she also recognized one face, the icy, golden-eyed features of Petronella Vivar's bodyguard. She recalled that his name was Maggard, and was amazed at the sheer size of the man, his physique bulky and muscled beyond that of the army soldiers who accompanied him. The exposed flesh of his muscles bore freshly healing scars, and his face displayed a nascent gigantism similar to Loken's. He stood out amongst the uniformed army soldiers, and his presence only lent credence to Sinderman's wild theory that Petronella Vivar's disappearance had nothing to do with her returning to Terra.
Take the Iterator and the Remembrancer back to their quarters, said Malakhurst. Post guards and ensure that there are no more breaches.
Maggard nodded and stepped forwards. Mercedy tried to avoid him, but he was quick and strong, grabbing her by the scruff of her neck and hauling her towards the door. Sinderman stood of his own accord and allowed himself to be led away by the other soldiers. Malakhurst stood between Loken and the door. If Loken wanted to stop Maggard and his men, he would have to go through Malakhurst.
Captain Loken,
called Sinderman as he was marched off the practice deck.
If you wish to understand more, read the Chronicles of Ursh again. There you will find illumination.
Mercedy tried to look back. She could see Loken beyond Malakhurst's robed form, looking like a caged animal, ready to attack. The door slammed shut, and Mercedy stopped struggling as Maggard led her and Sinderman back towards their quarters. Chapter 2. Perfection. Iterator. What we do best. Perfection. The dead greenskins were a testament to it. Deep Orbital DS-191 had been conquered in a matchless display of combat. Fields of fire overlapping like dancers' fans, squads charging in to slaughter the orcs that the guns could not finish. Squad by squad, room by room, the Emperor's children had killed their way through the Xenos holding the space station with all the handsome perfection of combat that Fulgrim had taught his legion. As the warriors of his company dispatched any surviving greenskins, Saul Tarvitz removed his helmet and immediately recoiled at the stench. The greenskins had inhabited the orbital for some time, and it showed. Fungal growths pulsed on the dark metal struts of the main control center, and crude shrines of weapons, armor, and tribal fetishes were piled against the command posts. Above him, the transparent dome of the control center looked onto the void of space. The Kalanides system, a collection of imperial worlds under attack by the greenskins, was visible amid the froth of stars. Capturing the orbital back from the orcs was the first stage in the imperial relief of Kalanides, and the Emperor's children and Iron Hand's legions would soon be storming into the enemy strongholds on Kalanides 4.
What a stink,
said a voice behind Tarvitz, and he turned to see Captain Lucius, the finest swordsman of the Emperor's children. His compatriot's armor was spattered black, and his elegant sword still crackled with the blood sizzling on its blue-hot blade. Damned animals! They don't have the sense to roll over and die when you kill them. Lucius's face had once been perfectly flawless, an echo of Fulgrim's Legion itself, but now, after one too many jibes about how he looked more like a pampered boy than a warrior, and the influence of Serena de Angelis, Lucius had started to acquire scars, each one uniform and straight in a perfect grid across his face. No enemy blade had etched them into his face, for Lucius was far too sublime a warrior to allow a mere enemy to mark his features.
They're tough, I'll give them that,
agreed Tarvitz.
They may be tough, but there's no elegance to their fighting, said Lucius. There's no sport in killing them. You sound disappointed.
Well, of course I am, aren't you? Asked Lucius, jabbing his sword through a dead greenskin and carving a curved pattern on his back. How can we achieve ultimate perfection with such poor specimens to better ourselves against?
Don't underestimate the greenskins, said Tarvitz. These animals invaded a compliant world and slaughtered all the troops we left to defend it. They have spaceships and weapons we don't understand, and they attack as if war is some kind of religion to them.
He turned over the closest corpse, a massive brute with skin as tough as gnarled bark, its violent red eyes open, and its undershot maw still grimacing with rage. Only the spread of entrails beneath suggested it was dead at all. Tarvitz could almost feel the jarring of his broadsword as he had plunged it through the creature's midriff, and its tremendous strength as it had tried to force him onto his knees. You talk about them as if we need to understand them before we can kill them. They're just animals, said Lucius with a sardonic laugh. You think about things too much. That's always been your problem, Saul, and it's why you'll never reach the dizzying heights I will achieve. Come on, just revel in the kill. Tarvitz opened his mouth to respond, but he kept his thoughts to himself as Lord Commander Eidolon strode into the control center.
Fine work, Emperor's children,
shouted Eidolon. As one of Fulgrim's chosen, Eidolon had the honor of being within the tight circle of officers who surrounded the Primarch and represented the Legion's finest artistry of war. Although it was not bred into him to dislike a fellow Astartes, Tarvitz had little respect for Eidolon. His arrogance did not befit a warrior of the Emperor's children, and the antagonism between them had only grown on the fields of murder in the war against the Megarachnids. Despite Tarvitz's reservations, Eidolon carried a powerful natural authority about him, accentuated by magnificent armor, with such an overabundance of gilding that the purple colors of the Legion were barely visible.
The vermin didn't know what hit them.
The Emperor's children cheered in response. It had been a classic victory for the Legion, hard, fast, and perfect. The greenskins had been doomed from the start.
Make ready,
shouted Eidolon,
to receive your Primarch.
The cargo decks of the deep orbital were rapidly cleared of the greenskin dead by the Legion's menials for a portion of the Kalanides battle force to assemble. Tarvitz felt his pulse race at the thought of setting eyes on his beloved Primarch once more. It had been too long since the Legion had fought alongside their leader. Hundreds of Emperor's children in perfectly dressed ranks stood to attention, a magnificent army in purple and gold. As magnificent as they were but a poor imitation of the incredible warrior who was father to them all. The Primarch of the Emperor's children was awe-inspiring. His face pale and sculpted, framed by a flowing mane of albino white hair. His very presence was intoxicating, and Tarvitz felt a fierce pride fill him at the sight of this incredible, wondrous warrior. Created to echo a facet of war, Fulgrim's art was the pursuit of perfection through battle, and he sought it as diligently as an imagist strove for perfection through his Picts. One shoulder of his golden armor was worked into a sweeping eagle's wing, the emblem of the Emperor's children, and the symbolism was a clear statement of Legion pride.
Have your men look for
The Palatine Aquila was the Emperor's personal symbol, and he had granted the Emperor's children alone the right to bear that same heraldry, symbolically proclaiming Fulgrim's warriors as his most adored legion. Fulgrim wore a golden-hilted sword at his hip, said to have been a gift from the War Master himself, a clear sign of the bond of brotherhood between them. The officers of the Primarch's inner circle flanked him. Lord Commander Eidolon, Apothecary Fabius, Chaplain Charmosian, and the massive dreadnought body of ancient Rylanor. Even these heroes of the Legion were dwarfed by Fulgrim's physical size and his sheer charisma. A line of heralds, chosen from among the young initiates who were soon to complete their training as Emperor's children, fanned out in front of Fulgrim, playing a blaring fanfare on their golden trumpets to announce the arrival of the most perfect warrior in the galaxy. A thunderous roar of applause swelled from the assembled Emperor's children as they welcomed their Primarch back to his Legion. Fulgrim waited graciously for the applause to die down. More than anything, Tarvitz aspired to be that awesome golden figure in front of them, though he knew he had already been designated as a line officer and nothing more. But Fulgrim's very presence filled him with the promise that he could be so much better if he was only given the chance. His pride in his Legion's prowess caught light as Fulgrim looked over the assembled warriors, and the Primarch's dark eyes shone as he acknowledged each and every one of them. "My brothers," called Fulgrim, his voice lilting and golden, "this day you have shown the accursed greenskin what it means to stand against the children of the Emperor." More applause rolled around the cargo decks, but Fulgrim spoke over it, his voice easily cutting through the clamor of his warriors. "Commander Eidolon has wrought you into a weapon against which the greenskin had no defense. Perfection, strength, resolve. These qualities are the cutting edge of this Legion, and you have shown them all here today. This orbital is in Imperial hands once more, as are the others the Greenskins had occupied in the futile hope of fending off our invasion. The time has come to press home this attack against the Greenskins and liberate the Kalanides system. My brother Primarch, Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands, and I shall see to it that not a single alien stands upon land claimed in the name of the Crusade." Expectation was heavy in the air as the Legion waited for the order that would send them into battle with their Primarch. "But most of you, my brothers, will not be there," said Fulgrim. The crushing disappointment Tarvitz felt was palpable, for the Legion had been sent to the Kalanides system with the assumption that it would lend its full strength to the destruction of the invading Xenos. "The Legion will be divided," continued Fulgrim, raising his hands to stem the cries of woe and lamentation that his words provoked. "I will lead a small force to join Ferrus Manus and his Iron Hands at Kalanides 4. The rest of the Legion will rendezvous with the War Master's 63rd expedition at the Istvan system. These are the orders of the War Master and of your Primarch. Lord Commander Eidolon will lead you to Istvan, and he will act in my stead until I can join you once more." Tarvitz glanced at Lucius, unable to read the expression on the swordsman's face at the news of their new orders. Conflicting emotions warred within Tarvitz, aching loss to be parted from his Primarch once more, and excited anticipation at the thought of fighting alongside his comrades in the Sons of Horus. "Commander, if you please," said Fulgrim, gesturing Eidolon to step forwards. Eidolon nodded and said, "The War Master has called upon us to aid his Legion in battle once more. He recognizes our skills, and we welcome this chance to prove our superiority. We are to halt a rebellion in the Istvan system, but we are not to fight alone. As well as his own Legion, the War Master has seen fit to deploy the Death Guard and World Eaters." A muttered gasp spread around the cargo bay at the mention of such brutal legions. Eidolon chuckled. "I see some of you remember fighting alongside our brother Astartes. We all know what a grim and artless business war becomes in the hands of such men, so I say this is the perfect opportunity to show the War Master how the Emperor's chosen fight." The Legion cheered once more, and Tarvitz knew that whenever the Emperor's children had a chance to prove their skill and artistry, especially to the other legions, they took it. Fulgrim had turned pride into a virtue, and it drove each warrior of his Legion to heights of excellence that no other could match. Torgadon had called it arrogance, and on the surface of murder, Tarvitz had tried to dissuade him of that notion. But hearing the boastful cries of the Emperor's children around him, he wasn't sure that his friend had been wrong after all. "The War Master has requested our presence immediately," shouted Eidolon through the cheering. "Although Istvan is not far distant, the conditions in the warp have become more difficult, so we must make all haste. The strike cruiser Andronius will leave for Istvan in 4 hours.
Wait.
When we arrive, it will be as ambassadors for our legion, and when the battle is done, the War Master will have witnessed war at its most magnificent. Eidolon saluted, and Fulgrim led the applause before turning and taking his leave. Tarvitz was stunned. To commit such a force of Astartes was rare, and he knew that whatever foe they would face on Istvan must be mighty indeed. Even the thrill of excitement he felt at this opportunity to prove themselves before the War Master was tempered by a sudden, nagging sense of unease. 4 legions? Asked Lucius, echoing his own thoughts as the squads fell out to make ready for the journey to join the 63rd expedition. For one system? That's absurd. Careful, Lucius. You veer close to arrogance, Tarvitz pointed out. Are you questioning the War Master's decision? Questioning, no, said Lucius defensively. But come on. Even you have to admit it's a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Possibly, conceded Tarvitz. But for the Istvan system to rebel, it must have been compliant at one stage. What's your point? My point, Lucius, is that the Crusade was supposed to be pushing ever outwards, conquering the galaxy in the name of the Emperor. Instead, it is turning back on itself to patch up the cracks. I can only assume that the War Master wants to make some kind of grand gesture to show his enemies what rebellion means. Ungrateful bastards, spat Lucius. Once we're done with Istvan, they'll beg us to take them back. With 4 legions sent against them, replied Tarvitz, I don't think there'll be many Istvanians left first to take back. Come, Saul, said Lucius, walking ahead of him. Did you lose your taste for battle against the Greenskins? A taste for battle? Tarvitz had never considered such an idea. He had always fought because he wanted to become more than he was, to strive for perfection in all things. For longer than he could remember, he had devoted himself to the task of emulating the warriors of the Legion who were more gifted and more worthy than he. He knew his station within the Legion, but knowing one's station was the first step to bettering it. Watching Lucius's arrogant swagger, Tarvitz was reminded of how much his fellow captain loved battle. Lucius loved it without shame or apology, seeing it as the best way to express himself, weaving between his enemies and cutting a path of bloody ruin through them with his flashing sword. It just concerns me, said Tarvitz. What does? Asked Lucius, turning back to face him. Tarvitz could see the hastily masked exasperation on the swordsman's face. He had seen that expression more and more on Lucius's scarred features recently, and it saddened him to know that the swordsman's ego and rampant ambition to rise within the ranks of the Emperor's children would be the undoing of their friendship. That the Crusade has to repair itself at all. Compliance used to be the end of it, not now. Don't worry, smiled Lucius. Once a few of these rebel worlds get a decent killing, this will all be over, and the Crusade will go on. Rebel worlds. Who ever thought to hear such a phrase? Tarvitz said nothing as he considered the sheer numbers of Astartes that would be converging on the Istvan system. Hundreds of Astartes had fought on deep orbital DS-191, but more than 10,000 Emperor's children made up the Legion, most of whom would be journeying to Istvan III. That in itself was enough for several war zones. The thought of 4 legions arrayed in battle sent shivers up Tarvitz's spine. What would be left of Istvan when 4 legions had marched through the system? Could any depths of rebellion really justify that? I just want victory, said Tarvitz, the words sounding hollow, even to him. Lucius laughed, but Tarvitz couldn't tell if it was in agreement or mockery. Being confined to his quarters was the most exquisite torture for Kirill Sinderman. Without the library of books he was used to consulting in Archive Chamber 3, he felt quite adrift. His own library, though extensive by any normal standards, was a paltry thing next to the arcana that had been destroyed in the fire. How many priceless, irreplaceable tomes had been lost in the wake of the warp beast he and Euphrates had conjured from the pages of the Book of Lorgar? It did not bear thinking about, and he wondered how much the future would condemn them for the knowledge that had been lost there. He had already filled thousands of pages with those fragments he could remember from the books he had consulted. Most of it was fragmentary and disjointed. He knew that the task of recalling everything he had read was doomed to failure, but he could no more conceive of giving up than he could stop his heart from beating.
His gift, and the gift of the Crusade, to the ages yet to come, was the accumulated wisdom of the galaxy's greatest thinkers and warriors. With the broad shoulders of such knowledge to stand upon, who knew what dizzying heights of enlightenment the Imperium might reach? His pen scratched across the page, recalling the philosophies of the Hellenic writers and their early debates on the nature of divinity. No doubt many would think it pointless to transcribe the writings of those long dead, but Sinderman knew that to ignore the past was to doom the future to repeat it. The text he wrote spoke of the ineffable inscrutability of false gods, and he knew that such mysteries were closer to the surface than he cared to admit. The things he had seen and read since 6319 had stretched his skepticism to the point where he could no longer deny the truth of what was plainly before him, and which Euphrates Keeler had been trying to tell them all. Gods existed, and in the case of the Emperor, moved amongst them. He paused for a moment as the full weight of that thought wrapped itself around him like a comforting blanket. The warmth and ease such simple acceptance gave him was like a panacea for all the ills that had troubled him this last year, and he smiled as his pen idly scratched across the page before him without his conscious thought. Sinderman started as he realized that the pen was moving across the page of its own volition. He looked down to see what was being written. She needs you. Cold fear gripped him, but even as it rose, it was soothed, and a comforting state of love and trust filled him. Images filled his head unbidden. The War Master, strong and powerful in his newly forged suit of black plate armor, the amber eye glowing like a coal from the furnace. Claws slid from the War Master's gauntlets, and an evil red glow built from his gorget, illuminating his face with a ghastly demonic light. "No," breathed Sinderman, feeling a great and unspeakable horror fill him at this terrible vision. But no sooner had this image filled his head than it was replaced by one of Euphrates Keeler lying supine on her medical bed. Terrified thoughts were banished at the sight of her, and Sinderman felt his love for this beautiful woman fill him as a pure and wondrous light. Even as he smiled in rapture, the vision darkened and yellowed talons slid into view, tearing at the image of Euphrates. Sinderman screamed in sudden premonition. Once again, he looked at the words on the page, marveling at their desperate simplicity. She needs you. Someone was sending him a message. The Saint was in danger. Coordinating a Legion's assets, its Astartes, its spacecraft, staff and accompanying Imperial Army units was a truly Herculean task. Managing to coordinate the arrival of 4 legions in the same place at the same time was an impossible task. Impossible for anyone but the War Master. The vengeful spirit, its long flat prow like the tip of a spear, slid from the warp in a kaleidoscopic display of pyrotechnics. Lightning raking across its sides as the powerful warp integrity fields took the full force of re-entry. In the interstellar distance, the closest star of the Istvan system glinted, cold and hard against the blackness. The Eye of Horus glared from the top of the ship's prow, the entire vessel having been refitted following the victory against the technocracy. The bone white of the lunar wolves replaced by the metallic grey-green of the sons of Horus. Within moments, another ship broke through, tearing its way into real space with the brutal functionality of its legion. Where the vengeful spirit had a deadly grace to it, the newcomer was brutish and ugly. Its hull, a drab gunmetal grey, its only decoration, a single brazen skull on its prow. The vessel was the Endurance, capital ship of the Death Guard fleet, accompanying the War Master, and a flotilla of smaller cruisers and escorts flew in its wake. All with the same unembellished gunmetal, for nothing in Mortarian's Legion bore any more adornment than was necessary. Several hours later, the powerful stabbing form of the Conqueror broke through to join the War Master. Shimmering with the white and blue colors of the World Eaters, the Conqueror was Angren's flagship, and its blunt, muscular form echoed the legendary ferocity of the World Eaters' Primarch. Finally, the Andronius, at the head of the Emperor's Children fleet, joined the growing Istvan strike force. The vessel itself was resplendent in purple and gold, more like a flying palace than a ship of war. Its appearance was deceptive, however, for the gun decks bristled with weapons manned by well-drilled menials who lived and died to serve Fulgrim's legion. The Andronius, for all its decorative folly, was a compact, lethal weapon of war. The Great Crusade had rarely seen a fleet of such power assembled in one place. Until now, only the Emperor had commanded such a force, but his place was on distant Terra, and these legions answered only to the War Master. So it was that 4 legions gathered and turned their eyes towards the Istvan system. The klaxons announcing the Vengeful Spirit's translation back to real space were the spur to action that Kirill Sinderman had been waiting for. Mopping his brow with an already moist handkerchief, he pushed himself to his feet and made his way to the shutter of his quarters. He took a deep, calming breath as the shutter rose and he was confronted by the hostile stares of 2 army soldiers, their starched uniforms insignia free and anonymous. "Can I help you, sir?" asked a tall man with a cold, unhelpful expression. "Yes," said Sinderman, his voice perfectly modulated to convey his non-threatening affability. "I need to travel to the Medicaid deck." "You don't look sick," said the second guard. Sinderman chuckled, reaching out to touch the man's arm like a kindly grandfather. "No, it's not me, my boy. It's a friend of mine. She's rather ill, and I promised that I would look in on her." "Sorry," said the first guard, in a tone that suggested he was anything but. "We've got orders from the Astartes not to let anyone off this deck." I see, sighed Sinderman, letting a tear trickle from the corner. "I don't want to be an inconvenience, my boys, but my friend, well, she's like a daughter to me, you see. She is very dear to me, and you would be doing an old man a very real favor if you could just let me see her." "I don't think so, sir," said the guard, but Sinderman could already detect a softening in his tone and pushed a little harder. She has not long left to her, and I was told by Malachhurst himself that I would be allowed to see her before the end." Using Malachhurst's name was a gamble, but it was a calculated gamble. These men were unlikely to have any formal channel to contact the War Master's equerry, but if they decided to check, he would be unmasked. Sinderman kept his voice low and soft as he played the grandfatherly role, utilizing every trick he had learned as an iterator, the precise timbre of his voice, the frailty of his posture, keeping eye contact and empathy with his audience. "Do you have children, my boy?" asked Sinderman, reaching out to clasp the guard's arm. "Yes, sir, I do." "Then you understand why I have to see her," pressed Sinderman, risking the more direct approach and hoping that he had judged these men correctly. "You're just going to the Medicaid deck?" asked the guard. "No, father," promised Sinderman. "I just need some time to say my goodbyes to her. That's all. Please?" The guards exchanged glances, and Sinderman fought to keep the smile from his face, as he knew he had them. The first soldier nodded, and they moved aside to let him pass. "Just the Medicaid deck, old man," said the guard, scrawling on a chit that would allow him passage through the ship to the Medicaid deck and back. "If you're not back in your quarters in a couple of hours, I'll be dragging you back here myself." Sinderman nodded, taking the proffered chit and shaking both men warmly by the hand. "You're good soldiers, boys," he said, his voice dripping with gratitude. "Good soldiers. I'll be sure to tell Malachhurst of your compassion for an old man." He turned quickly so that they didn't see the relief on his face and hurried away down the corridor towards the Medicaid deck. The companionways echoed with their emptiness as he made his way through the twisting maze of the ship, an idiot smile plastered across his puffing features. Entire worlds had fallen under the spell of his oratory, and here he was smiling about duping 2 simple-minded guards to let him out of his room. How the mighty had fallen. "Is there any more news on Varvarus?" asked Loken, as he and Torgadden walked through the Museum of Conquest on their way to the Lupercal's court. Torgadden shook his head. "The shells were too fragmented. Apothecary Vadden wouldn't be able to make a match even if we found the weapon that fired the shot. It was one of ours, but that's all we got." The museum was brimming with artifacts won from the Legion's many victories. for the lunar wolves had brought a score of worlds into compliance. A grand statue dominating one wall recalled the days when the Emperor and Horus had fought side by side in the first campaigns of the Great Crusade. The Emperor, sword in hand, fought off slender, masked aliens, while Horus, back to back with his father, blazed away with a bolt gun. Beyond the statue, Loken recognized a display of bladed insectoid limbs. A blend of metallic and biological flesh wrested from the megarachnids on Murder. Only a few of these trophies had been won after Horus's investiture as War Master, the majority having been taken before the Lunar Wolves had been renamed the Sons of Horus in honor of the War Master's accomplishments.
The remembrances are next, said Loken. They are asking too many questions. Some of them may already have been murdered.
Who?
Ignace and Petronella Viva.
Carcassy, said Torgadon.
Damn. I'd heard he'd killed himself, but I should have known they'd find a way to do it. The Warrior Lodge was talking about silencing him, Abaddon in particular. They didn't call it murder, though, although Abaddon seemed to think it was the same as killing an enemy in war. That's when I broke with the Lodge.
Did they say how it was to be done?
Torgadon shook his head.
No, just that it needed to be done.
It won't be long before all this is out in the open, promised Loken. The Lodge doesn't move under a veil of secrecy anymore, and soon there will be a reckoning.
Then what do we do?
Loken looked away from his friend at the high arch that led from the museum and into the Lupercal's court.
I don't know,
he said, waving Torgadon to silence as he caught sight of a figure moving behind one of the furthest cabinets.
What's up?
Asked Torgadon.
I'm not sure,
said Loken, moving between display cabinets of gleaming swords captured from an ancient feudal kingdom and strange alien weapons taken from the many species the Legion had destroyed. The figure he had seen was another Astartes, and Loken recognized the colors of the World Eaters upon his armor. Loken and Torgadon rounded the corner of a tall walnut-framed cabinet, seeing a scarred Astartes warrior peering intently at an immense battle glaive that had been wrested from the hands of a Xenos Praetorian by the War Master himself.
Welcome to the Vengeful Spirit, said Loken.
The World Eater looked up from the weapon and turned to face them. His face was deeply bronzed, long and noble, contrasting with the bone white and blue of his Legion's colors.
Greetings,
He said, bringing his forearm across his armored chest in a martial salute.
Khan, 8th Assault Company of the World Eaters.
Loken of the 10th,
replied Loken.
Torgadon of the 2nd,
Nodded Torgadon.
Impressive, this,
Said Khan, looking around him.
Thank you.
Said Loken.
The War Master always believed we should remember our enemies. If we forget them, we shall never learn.
He pointed at the weapon Khan had been admiring.
We have the preserved corpse of the creature that carried this weapon somewhere around here. It's the size of a tank.
Angron has his share of trophies too,
said Khan.
but only from foes that deserve to be remembered.
Should we not remember them all?
No, said Khan firmly. There is nothing to gain from knowing your enemy. The only thing that matters is that they are to be destroyed. Everything else is just a distraction.
Spoken like a true World Eater,
said Torgadon. Khan looked up from the weapon with an amused sneer.
You seek to provoke me, Captain Torgadon, but I already know what other legions think of the World Eaters.
We were on Aureus,
said Loken.
You are butchers.
Khan smiled.
Ha! Honesty is rare these days, Captain Loken. Yes, we are. And we are proud because we are good at it. My Pramak is not ashamed of what he does best, so neither am I.
I trust you're here for the conclave,
asked Loken, wishing to change the subject.
Yes, I serve as my Pramak's equerry.
Torgadon raised an eyebrow.
Tough job?
Sometimes, admitted Khan.
Angron cares little for diplomacy.
The War Master believes it is important.
So I see. But all legions do things differently,
laughed Khan, clapping Loken on his shoulder guard.
As one honest man to another. Your own legion has as many detractors as admirers.
Too damn superior, the lot of you.
The War Master has high standards, said Loken.
So does Angron, I assure you, said Khan, and Loken was surprised to hear a note of weariness in Khan's voice. The Emperor knew that sometimes the best course of action is to let the World Eaters do what we do best. The War Master knows it too. Otherwise, we would not be here. It may be distasteful to you, Captain, but if it were not for warriors like mine, the Great Crusade would have founded long ago.
There we must agree to disagree, said Loken. I could not do what you do.
Khan shook his head. You're a warrior of the Astartes, Captain. If you had to kill every living thing in a city to ensure victory, you would do it. We must always be prepared to go further than our enemy. All the legions know it. The World Eaters just preach it openly.
Let us hope it never comes to that.
Do not pin too much on that hope. I hear tell that Istvan III will be difficult to break.
What do you know of it?
Asked Torgaden. Khan shrugged.
Nothing specific, just rumors really. Something religious, they say. Witches and warlocks, skies turning red, and monsters from the warp. All the usual hyperbole. Not that the Sons of Horus would believe such things.
The galaxy is a complicated place,
replied Loken carefully.
We don't know the half of what goes on in it.
I'm beginning to wonder myself,
agreed Khan.
It's changing,
continued Loken.
The galaxy, and the Crusade with it.
Yes, said Khan with relish. It is. Loken was about to ask Khan what he meant when the doors to the Lupercal's court swung open. Evidently, the War Master's conclave will begin soon, said Khan, bowing before them both. It is time for me to rejoin my Primarch.
And we must join the War Master,
said Loken.
Perhaps we will see you on Istvan III?
Perhaps, nodded Khan, walking off between the spoils of 100 wars. If there's anything left of Istvan III when the World Eaters finish with it. Chapter 3. Horus enthroned. The Saint is in danger. Istvan III. Lupercal's court was a new addition to the vengeful spirit. Previously, the War Master had held briefings and planning sessions on the Strategium, but it had been decided that he needed somewhere grander to hold court. Designed by Peter Egon Momus, it had been artfully constructed to place the War Master in a setting more suited to his position as the leader of the Great Crusade, and present him as the first among equals to his fellow commanders. Vast banners hung from the sides of the room, most belonging to the Legion's battle companies, though there were a few that Loken didn't recognize. He saw one with a throne of skulls, set against a tower of brass rising from a blood-red sea, and another with an 8-pointed black star shining in a white sky. The meaning of such obscure symbols confounded Loken, but he assumed that they represented the warrior lodge that had become integral to the Legion. Greater than all the majesty designed by the architect-designate was the Primarch of the Sons of Horus himself, enthroned before them on a great basalt throne. Abaddon and Aximand stood to one side. Both warriors were armored, Abaddon in the glossy black of the Justaerin, Aximand in his pale green plate. The two officers glared at Loken and Torgaden, the enmity that had grown between them during the Orician campaign too great to hide any more. As he met Abaddon's flinty gaze, Loken felt great sadness as he realized that the glorious ideal of the Mournival was finally and irrevocably dead. None of them spoke as Loken and Torgaden took their places on the other side of the War Master. Loken had stood with these warriors and sworn an oath by the light of a reflected moon on a planet the inhabitants called Terra to counsel the War Master and preserve the soul of the Legion. That felt like a very long time ago.
Loken, Torgaden,
said Horus, and even after all that had happened, Loken felt honored to be so addressed.
Your role here is simply to observe and remind our Legion brothers of the solidity of our cause. Do you understand?
Yes, my War Master,
said Torgaden.
Loken,
asked the War Master.
Loken nodded and took his allotted position.
Yes, War Master.
He felt the War Master's penetrating eyes boring into him, but kept his gaze fixed firmly on the arches that led into the Lupercal's court, as the doors beneath one of them slid open. The tramp of feet sounded, and a blood-red angel of death emerged from the shadows. Loken had seen the Primarch of the World Eaters before, but was still awed by his monstrous physical presence. Angron was huge, easily as tall as the War Master, but also massively broad, with wide, hulking shoulders like some enormous beast of burden. His face was scarred and violent, his eyes buried deep in folds of angry red scar tissue. Ugly cortical implants jutted from his scalp, connected to the collar of his armor by ribbed cables. The Primarch's armor was ancient and bronze, like that of a feral world god, with heavy metal plates over mail and twin chain axes strapped to his back. Loken had heard that Angron had once been a slave before the Emperor had found him, and that his masters had forced the implants on him to turn him into a psychotic killer for their fighting pits. Looking at Angron, Loken could well believe it. Angron's equerry, Khan, flanked the terrifying Primarch, his expression neutral where his master's was thunder.
Horus,
Said Angron, his voice rough and brutal.
I see the War Master welcomes his brother like a king. Am I your subject now?
Angron, replied Horus, unperturbed. It is good that you could join us.
And miss all this prettiness? Not for the world,
said Angron, his voice loaded with the threat of a smoldering volcano. A second delegation arrived through another of the arches, arrayed in the purple and gold of the Emperor's children. Led by Eidolon in all his magnificence, a squad of Astartes with glittering swords marched alongside the Lord Commander, their battle gear as ornate as their leaders.
War Master, the Lord Fulgrim sends his regards,
stated Eidolon formally and with great humility. Loken saw that Eidolon had learned the ways of a practiced diplomat since he had last spoken to the War Master.
He assures you that his task is well underway and that he will join us soon. I speak for him and command the Legion in his stead.
Loken's eyes darted from Angron to Eidolon, seeing the obvious antipathy between the two legions. The Emperor's children and the World Eaters were as different as could be. Angron's legion fought and won through raw aggression, while the Emperor's children had perfected the art of picking an enemy force apart and destroying it a piece at a time.
Lord Angron,
said Eidolon with a bow.
It is an honor.
Angron did not deign to reply, and Loken saw Eidolon stiffen at this insult. But any immediate confrontation was averted as the final delegation to the War Master entered the Lupercal's court. Mortarion, Primarch of the Death Guard, was backed by a unit of warriors armored in the dull gleam of unpainted Terminator plate. Mortarion's armor was also bare, with the brass skull of the Death Guard on one shoulder guard. His pallid face and scalp were hairless and pocked, his mouth and throat hidden by a heavy collar that hissed spurts of grey steam as he breathed. A Death Guard captain marched beside the Primarch, and Loken recognized him with a smile. Captain Nathaniel Garrow had fought alongside the Sons of Horus in the days when they had been known as the Lunar Wolves. The Terran-born captain had won many friends within the War Master's Legion for his unshakable code of honor and his straightforward, honest manner. The Death Guard warrior caught Loken's gaze and gave a perfunctory nod of greeting. "With our brother Mortarion," said Horus, "we are complete." The War Master stood and descended from the elevated throne to the center of the court as the lights dimmed and a glowing globe appeared above him, hovering just below the ceiling. "This," said Horus, "is Istvan III, courtesy of Servitor-manned stellar cartography drones. Remember it well, for history will be made here." Jonah Arukan paused in his labors and slipped a small hip flask from beneath his uniform jacket as he checked for anyone watching. The hangar bay was bustling with activity, as it always seemed to be these days, but no one was paying him any attention. The days when an Imperator Titan being made ready for war would pause even the most jaded war maker in his tracks were long past. for there were few here who had not seen the mighty form of the Dies Irae being furnished for battle scores of times already. He took a hit from the flask and looked up at the old girl. The Titan's hull was scored and dented with wounds the Mechanicum servitors had not yet had time to patch, and Jonah patted the thick plates of her leg armor affectionately. "Well, old girl," he said, "you've certainly seen some action, but I still love you." He smiled at the thought of a man being in love with a machine, but he'd love anything that had saved his life as often as the Dies Irae had. Through the fires of uncounted battles, they had fought together, and as much as Titus Cassar denied it, Jonah knew that there was a mighty heart and soul at the core of this glorious war machine. Jonah took another drink from his flask as his expression turned sour, thinking of Titus and his damned servant. Titus said he felt the light of the Emperor within him, but Jonah didn't feel much of anything anymore. As much as he wanted to believe in what Titus was preaching, he just couldn't let go of the skeptical core at the center of his being. To believe in things that weren't there, that couldn't be seen or felt. Titus called it faith, but Jonah was a man who needed to believe in what was real, what could be touched and experienced. Princeps Turnit would discharge him from the crew of the Dies Irae if he knew he had attended prayer meetings back on Darwin, and the thought of spending the rest of the crusade as a menial, denied forever the thrill of commanding the finest war machine ever to come from the forges of Mars, sent a cold shiver down his spine. Every few days, Titus would ask him to come to another prayer meeting, and the times he said yes, they would furtively make their way to some forsaken part of the ship to listen to passages read from the Lectitio Divinitatis. Each time he would sweat the journey back for fear of discovery, and the court-martial would no doubt follow. Jonah had been a career Titan crewman since the day he had first set foot aboard his inaugural posting, a warhound Titan called the Venator, and he knew that if it came down to a choice, he would choose the Dies Irae over the Lectitio Divinitatis every time. But still, the thought that Titus might be right continued to nag at him. He leaned back against the Titan's leg, sliding down until he was sitting on his haunches with his knees drawn up to his chest. "Faith," he whispered. "You can't earn it, and you can't buy it. Where then do I find it?"
"Well," said a voice behind and above him, "you can start by putting that flask away and coming with me." Jonah looked up and saw Titus Cassar, resplendent as always in his parade-ready uniform, standing in the arched entrance to the Titan's leg bastions.
"Titus," said Jonah, hurriedly stuffing the hip flask back into his jacket. "What's up?"
"We have to go," said Titus urgently. "The Saint is in danger." Maggard stalked along the shadowed companionways with the vengeful spirit at a brisk pace, marching at double time with the vigor of a man on his way to a welcome rendezvous. His hulking form had been steadily growing over the last few months, as though he was afflicted with some hideous form of rapid gigantism. But the procedures the War Master's apothecaries were performing on his frame were anything but hideous. His body was changing, growing and transforming beyond anything the crude surgeries of House Carpenters had ever managed. Already, he could feel the new organs within him, reshaping his flesh and bone into something greater than he could ever have imagined, and this was just the beginning. His Curlium blade was unsheathed, shimmering with a strange glow in the dim light of the corridor. He wore fresh white robes, his enlarging physique already too massive for his armor. Legion artificers stood ready to reshape it once his flesh had settled into its new form, and he missed its reassuring solidity enclosing him. Like him, his armor would be born anew, forged into something worthy of the War Master and his chosen warriors. Maggard knew he was not yet ready for such inclusion, but he had already carved himself a niche within the Sons of Horus. He walked where the Astartes could not, acted where they could not be seen to act, and spilled blood where they needed to be seen as peacemakers. It required a special kind of man to do such work, efficiently and conscience-free, and Maggard was perfectly suited to his new role. He had killed hundreds of people at the behest of House Carpenters, and many more than that before he had been captured by them. But these had been poor, messy killings compared to the death he now carried.
He remembered the sense of magnificent beginnings when Malaghurst had tasked him with the death of Ignace Carcassy. Maggard had jammed the barrel of his pistol beneath the poet's quivering jaw and blown his brains out over the roof of his cramped room before letting the generously fleshed body crash to the floor in a flurry of bloody papers. Why Malaghurst had required Carcassy's death did not concern Maggard. The equerry spoke with the voice of Horus, and Maggard had pledged his undying loyalty to the War Master on the battlefield of Darwin when he had offered him his sword. Later, whether in reward or as part of his ongoing designs, the War Master had killed his former mistress, Petronella Vivar, and for that, Maggard was forever in his debt. Whatever the War Master desired, Maggard would move heaven or hell to see it done. Now, he had been ordered to do something wondrous. Now, he was going to kill a saint. Cinderman beat his middle finger against his chin in a nervous tattoo as he tried to look as if he belonged in this part of the ship. Deck crew in orange jumpsuits and ordnance officers in yellow jackets threaded past him as he awaited his accomplices in this endeavor. He clutched the chit the guard had given him tightly, as though it was some kind of talisman that would protect him if someone challenged him.
Come on, he whispered. Where are you?
It had been a risk contacting Titus Cassar, but he had no one else to turn to. Mercedy did not believe in the Lectitio Divinitatis, and in truth, he wasn't sure he did yet. But he knew that whatever or whoever had sent him the vision of Euphrates Keeler had meant him to act upon it. Likewise, Garviel Locum was out of the question, for it was certain that his movements would not escape notice.
Iterator,
Hissed a voice from beside him, and Cinderman almost cried aloud in surprise. Titus Cassar stood beside him, an earnest expression creasing his slender face. Another man stood behind him, similarly uniformed in the dark blue of a Titan crewman.
Titus,
Breathed Cinderman in relief.
I wasn't sure you'd be able to come. We won't have long before Princeps Turnip notices we are not at our posts, but your communication said the Saint was in danger.
She is, confirmed Cinderman.
Grave danger.
How do you know? Asked the second man. Cassar's brow twisted in annoyance.
I'm sorry, Kirill. This is Jonah Arukin, my fellow Moderati on the Diaz Array. He is one of us.
I just know, said Cinderman.
I saw, I don't know, a vision of her lying on her bed, and I just knew that someone intended her harm. A vision, breathed Cassar. Truly you are one of the chosen of the Emperor. No, hissed Cinderman. I'm really not. Now, come on. We don't have time for this. We have to go now. Where?
Asked Jonah.
The Medicaid deck, said Cinderman, holding up his chit. We have to get to the Medicaid deck.
The surface of the shimmering globe above Horus resolved into continents and oceans, overlaid with the traceries of geophysical features, plains, forests, seas, mountain ranges, and cities. Horus held up his arms, as if supporting the globe from below, like some titan from the ancient myths of old Earth. This is Istvan III, he repeated. A world brought into compliance 13 years ago by the 27th Expeditionary Force of our brother Korax.
And he wasn't up to the job,
snorted Angron. Horus shot Angron a dangerous look. There was some resistance, yes, but the last elements of the aggressive faction were destroyed by the Raven Guard at the Red Earth Valley. The battle site flared red on the globe, nestled among a mountain range on one of Istvan III's northern continents. The Remembrancer Order was not yet foisted upon us by the Council of Terra, but a substantial civilian contingent was left behind to begin integration with the Imperial Truth.
Are we to assume that the truth didn't take?
Asked Eidolon. Mortarion? Prompted Horus, gesturing to his brother Primarch.
4 months ago, the Death Guard received a distress signal from Istvan III,
said Mortarion.
It was weak and old. We only received it because one of our supply ships joining the fleet at Arcturan dropped out of the warp for repairs. Given the age of the signal and the time it took for it to be relayed to my command, it is likely that it was sent at least 2 years ago. What did it say?
Asked Angron. In reply, the holographic image of the globe unfolded into a large flat plane, like a pict screen hovering in the air, black with just a hint of shadowy movement. A shape moved on the screen, and Loken realized it was a face, a woman's face, orange lit by a candle flame that provided the only light. She appeared to be in a small, stone-walled chamber. Even over the poor quality of the signal, Loken could tell that the woman was terrified, her eyes wide and her breathing rapid and shallow. She gleamed with sweat.
The insignia on her collar, said Torgadon, is from the 27th expedition.
The woman adjusted the device she was using to record the image, and sound flooded into the Lupical's cord. Crackling flames, distant yelling and gunfire.
It's revolution, said the woman, her voice warped by static. Open revolt. These people, they've rejected it all. We tried to integrate them. We thought the War Singers were just some primitive superstition, but it was much more. It was real. Prowl has gone mad, and the War Singers are with him.
The woman suddenly looked around at something off-screen.
No!
She screamed desperately and opened fire with a weapon previously held out of view. Violent muzzle flashes lit her, and something indescribable flailed against the far wall as she emptied her weapon into it.
They're closer. They know we're here, and I think I'm the last one.
The woman turned back to the screen.
It's madness. Complete madness down here. Please. I don't think I'm going to get through this. Send someone, anyone, just make this stop.
A hideous, atonal keening sound blared from the pict screen. The woman grabbed her head, her screams drowned by the inhuman sound. The last frames jerked and fragmented, freeze-framing through a series of gruesome images. Blood in the woman's frenzied eye, a swirling mass of flesh and shattered stone, and a mouth locked open, blood on teeth. Then blackness.
There have been no further communications from Istvan 3,